Okay, that didn't work so well. I'm getting so fluent at this now, Jordan, that you normally sort of relax and sort of just let these interviews go live, and then you forget when you press a key on the keyboard that it stops your video intro.
Nice.
You have to start the whole thing again.
So we're gonna do round 3.
Yeah, no, we're good. We're good.
Okay.
Anyway, for those of you who've joined me, thank you for joining us for actually episode 5 of my second series of the real estate change discussion series. And as many of you know, if you've already watched before, I try to bring in a lot of sort of innovation leaders within the world of digital transformation in real estate to try and help us unpick and unravel some of the stuff that they're doing within their teams around leadership, around culture, and ultimately around that sort of integration within the sort of the PropTech digital transformation space and that sort of aging asset class that we have, and want to sort of understand a little bit more about it. So without further ado, Jordan, do you want to just give yourself a very, very quick introduction as to who you are, what your role is, team size, and how long you've been doing it, and all that, so people understand a little bit more?
Sure. So my name is Jordan Kostelac, and my job title is Director of PropTech for JLL Asia Pacific. Team size is really a team of 1. The nature of my role is more of a report out to our executive leadership, framing business strategy through the lens of technological change. We, as most people know, if you know JLL, a few years back, we launched a dedicated technologies and digital services division called creatively Jll Technologies. And so I sit sort of on the other side of the fence from Jll Technologies, looked like reframing it from the business's context, because sometimes, as you know, in big organizations, competing interests are not necessarily of different business lines are not necessarily those of the firm at large. And so where I sit is within the firm at large and trying to, steer the ship on the big course.
And just for those who don't know, Jordan, where are you based, and how long have you been in that role?
Yeah, so I cover all of Asia Pacific, but I'm based in Hong Kong, and I've been doing this role for a little over 4 years. I've been with JLL for just over 7, and I've been doing transformation work of different types for about 22 years now.
Making yourself sound old, Jordan.
I'm feeling old, man. I just put a bandage on my ankle because, I walked too much last week.
Well, let's not get into the Stepney world, shall we, of cryptocurrency and trying to drive the pace.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Oh, I think we should avoid that like the plague today, if I'm brutally honest. But for those of you who like your beer as well, I recommend speaking to Jordan about his love of craft beer, which is always entertaining. So without further ado, let me just sort of go into a little bit more about the format for those of you who are watching live. This isn't really about the live broadcast that we have. It's actually more about the sort of the edits as I go through on this, because I really like to try and sort of consolidate some of the thoughts and feelings into much more shorter form edits. But if any of you have got questions during this, please just pop them, whether you're watching this on YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever it might be, pop a question for Jordan and I'll bring it in at the end, because that will then allow that format to sort of work. So please do drop a line. But for those of you who are regular here, I have to just thank a little bit a few of my partners that I have. First and foremost, obviously the company that I set up 4.5 years ago, Unissu, the trusted PropTech Procurement platform, analyzing over 10,000 companies out there to help you find the ideal solution. And then 2 other sort of more industry-led partners. So on one hand, I'm working with the Save Business School and their online sort of executive program of leadership education. And having actually on those courses myself, I can heartily recommend them. And then secondly, industry partner with Equiem. If you're looking to transform your workplace into a world-class destination, I would highly encourage you to get involved with those guys as well. So this series wouldn't work if it wasn't for those. So thank you for those as a bit of a call out. So without further ado, Jordan, I suppose one of the first things I always like to ask the people who I interview is a very broad and holistic view of what does innovation actually look like at JLL. And I'm aware this may well be sort of that JLL Asia Pacific side, but could you just give people a bit of an idea in that sense?
Sure. I mean, I alluded earlier in the intro that a few years ago, we carved out a dedicated technologies division. And so I don't think that there's one face of innovation at JLL. And this is typical of any large services firm. We are an aggregate of hundreds of business lines. And now we have this technology side that, it's sort of tech-led rather than sort of business process-led. And that's still a dance that I think the entire industry is learning. Is it a sort of process of merger and acquisition, which we've seen a lot of, especially with Jll Technologies in the last few years? Is it in-house development, which I think anytime you're a large corporation like we are, there tends to be a bit of overconfidence of your capabilities, not just internally, but even externally. People sort of overestimate. So when startups are approaching us, they might assume that, hey, just bring us in. Like as soon as your clients see us, it's off to the races, right? And it doesn't work like that. We have a lot of competing interests. Even some of the business lines, what we might call a legacy business line within JLL, they have competing interests. And one of those interests is not, hey, can this technology displace what I do, right?
Yeah.
That shouldn't be confused though with resistance to change. I think the way that it really works for us, and the bigger mission I think that we have for innovation at JLL, is not to think that we could disintermediate. I think that's a misconception across all of innovation, but rather to amplify the parts that make people the best at what they do, and reduce as much tedium as possible through technologies. And that's where, I think my overall approach to transformation and change really tries to start with that first, which is how do we give people better sort of digital picks and shovels to do their jobs more effectively, rather than think, oh, we're just going to displace or replace them. So the best one I can point to within JLL, I think a misconception that is more from the outside, but is, and a lot of technology vendors approach us with is, oh, we can eliminate brokerage. And it's like, no, you can't. This is older than the industry itself. Before we defined ourselves as a property industry and a estate industry, you need people to facilitate this because you've got to go about the rest of your life. And so you look at things like more of like an Amazon Web Services approach. How do we build, again, better tools to execute the job rather than think we're going to automate the whole thing away?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And to sort of summarize, I suppose I've always looked at that as this is less about disruption and more about innovation. And then with innovation, you've got the radical and you've got the sort of incremental innovation. And I think you're absolutely right. There is a complete and utter misconception of really what this industry is all about. And so just bringing that back a little bit, perhaps, to that holistic perspective of JLL for a moment. And just for those of you who perhaps are not familiar with just how broad and large JLL is, if I'm not mistaken, Jordan, there's like 90,000 plus employees. And then within that, attitudes to innovation, I suppose, started, and maybe this is more America-led than anywhere else, but you were one of the founding partners of MIT's Real Estate Innovation Lab, as an example. But I just want to pick up the point that you made there about your interpretation of what it's all about. So JLL also have Jll Technologies, right? And you guys have deployed, I think, close to $350 million of capital into 40 or so startup businesses. Is that more about innovating the space than disrupting the space, or Jll Technologies, have they got a slightly different mandate to JLL in and of itself?
So this is a distinction that I've got to put up front. You're actually talking about even one pillar of Jll Technologies, which is JLL Spark. So this is corporate venture capital.
Okay.
Now, corporate venture capital, I don't actually work for Spark. I don't work for Jll Technologies. So some of the nuances I don't want to be taken as gospel here.
Yeah.
But let's look at the wider sort of role of corporate venture capital. I think that it's R&D budgets had disappeared quite a while ago in many companies. And corporate venture capital is sort of the new way to get to the frontier for a lot of big established companies. So it is external innovation with the hopeful knock-on effect of bringing the additional revenue or sort of the additional funds that good investing will bring in. And we at JLL Spark, we have there's very clear themes. If you go to JLL Spark's website and you check out the philosophies, it's things like ESG is at the top of the list, financial tech, construction technology, future of work, and there's one other that escapes me at the moment, but again, I don't work for Spark. I don't have to have them memorized yet. But yeah, all the numbers you spit out are correct. Some of those have led to acquisitions for the wider business. And, it is an interesting approach because, I think part of what has largely killed off R&D, unless your business is sort of founded on R&D, like, pharmaceutical companies or things like that, is that you get so big that you might have people that sort of bend your rules, but they still were forged by your rules, right? And that often doesn't breed a culture of innovation or new thinking. But I think on the other side, where you can run into trouble, and this goes back to this sort of misconception of what innovation is I think there's this overbearing notion that all innovation is good, all new ideas are good. And I think, to your point about this being American-led, I think the idea of intellectual property rights and originality stop us from just reevaluating, I think, part and parcel of existing processes. So when I talked about brokers, you're not going to disintermediate them. Again, how do you amplify what makes them great? And how do you remove tedium rather than say, okay, we built this top to bottom set of tools, take it in whole, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where the sort of process of external innovation by way of venture capital investment sort of lets it get tested outside of our environment and bring it in. And hopefully it appeals to that shiny object syndrome of, hey, I like that thing they've got, I want it for myself. That's what I think is working well, not just in our culture, but from a lot of the technological innovation of the past, I'll say 15 years.
Do you know what? I'd never really thought of it in that way, that by essentially having an entirely different identity, an entirely different, I suppose, objective, to be crass about it, you are enabling JLL to have that innovation function, which is then, I hesitate to use the word entirely complementary, but your last point there about it's enabling you to avoid that shiny object syndrome is absolutely bang on, because it means that there is a rigidity and a process around, are they the right company for us? And if they're not, they're not, right?
Well, the thing I'd add about that is the nice thing about a venture capital approach versus an R&D approach, right? R&D means you're going to have a sunk cost if it doesn't work. Venture capital can often mean that you invested in something that doesn't work for your company, but works. YouTube started as a dating site and has created an entire content creation platform, right? A lot of things aren't necessarily what they set out to be. And, being purpose designed for one thing, you watch what happens with it in the wild, and something else can happen. If it stays within the confines of a corporate R&D team, it never has the potential to be unleashed into a adjacent or even an unrelated industry. But by going through the venture capital route, which JLL Spark was the origin of Jll Technologies. So first Spark was formed and then sort of spun up all the technology parts into it. And I think that's a really effective way to go, because you have this innovation-led mindset coming in with it. And again, it creates new opportunity even if it's not necessarily straight within the confines of our existing business lines.
Yeah, it's really an interesting perspective from both sides. So I suppose taking it then forward, I mean, we've talked a little bit about JLL Spark, Jll Technologies, and how that all integrates together. But quite often when I interview the innovators within real estate, or who I perceive to be the innovators and the leaders in this space, quite often there is a personal journey to it all. And in some cases, people have been recruited into that role. In some cases, people have developed their own role. I'm really interested in that personal journey that has taken you from being Jordan to being Jordan, Director of PropTech at JLL Asia Pacific. Could you just chart that journey for us so people can really see how you've gone about it?
Sure. So I mentioned before that I've been doing change efforts or transformation efforts for about 22 years. That really started with being a pain in the ass, and that part of it hasn't ended. When I was 18, I started working in a warehouse, and this was right when e-commerce was becoming a thing. Like, we called it e-tailing back then. Amazon was in its infancy, and I was working for the clothing brand Gap.com. And it was meant to be a way for me to earn cash to help pay for school and just live a young person's life. And I was always I hope that it's now framed as sort of creatively malcontent, but I was constantly criticizing the way things were being done. And someone was smart enough to sort of harness that energy. I had a really great mentor who said, hey, if you don't have a better plan, shut up. If you have a better plan, map it out for us. And that was, and I'm from Columbus, Ohio. This is where all this happened. So it's very sort of that direct country type of thinking. And yeah, look, it worked. I didn't know what I wanted to be in school. And that helped me zero in on actually what I wanted to study. I just knew I had to go to college because that's what you're supposed to do. So that straight talk helped me figure out what I wanted to do. One of the requirements of going to college in the US, in Ohio, where I'm from, is that you have to take at least 1 year of a foreign language. Yes, if you can believe that, for the non-American audience, we do have such requirements. And wow. I agonized over my foreign language for the first 3 years of college. And a TV show inspired me to take Mandarin Chinese. So I took a year of Mandarin. And right as I was wrapping up my college career, the global financial crisis hit. I was bored with Ohio. So I decided to move to a city in China that no one had ever heard of, the city in central China called Wuhan. And yes, when I mention it, people are like, oh, and take a few steps back, right? But moving to Wuhan was an amazing cultural experience. It certainly helped me improve my Mandarin. I can order Chinese food with the best of them these days. I'm not sure I can still necessarily conduct a full business meeting, but it helped advance my Chinese skills. While I was there, I studied for the GMAT and then eventually got my MBA remotely. And that, while I was in Wuhan, I visited a friend here in Hong Kong. I fell in love with the city and visited quite a lot. So as I was finishing the first half of my MBA, I relocated to Hong Kong, started looking for a job and got a job from my sort of process engineering background. I got a job with a relocation and change management consultancy, and did quite a bit of work with them, doing change in workplace techs, including for some of the biggest names in the property industry, one of which was JLL. A couple years there, and I ended up being recruited to join JLL's workplace strategy and change management consultancy. So you can see that common thread of transformation coming through. And again, I hope it all comes from this place of creative malcontent, right? That, hey, I know it can be better. It's not that I don't like this, but to the point I made earlier, the best technologies eliminate tedious aspects of jobs. And that's why, I'm just sitting here thinking, like, this does not need to be this hard. And my contributions to this organization cannot be measured in how well I endure that. And that.
So, Jordan, just on in terms of that sort of headhunting for JLL,
Yeah.
Were they recruiting you into a specific role of that sort of change management type ethos, or was it something that you worked on with them to become what you are now? How did that all work?
It was more of a graduation from focusing on just the change delivery side to the front end strategy of designing new workspaces and new work modalities and things. So
Right.
I left a change management job at the previous company to go to JLL as a official title workplace strategist, but that had change delivery elements integrated into it. So it was like, we know you can do this, come do this as well. But I promise we're getting close to the end here and how we got there, because a few years of doing that, in the background, I was really sort of starting to study the wider conversation around the future of work. And I've been a technology nerd for as long as I could, play with dials. And so I was actually sending these unsolicited newsletters around to people in JLO. I started making a list of people I thought should know these things and say, hey, this technology.
And let's be frank, it's because you still maintain that pain in the ass mentality, right?
I try not to be confrontational, but I do like to confront issues. There are some things that, if I can't make sense of it, or if I think I can make sense of something, a better way to do things with the tools that we have in our hands, I try to push that agenda. And I think between that, and I did a very short stint while I was at my previous firm. I worked for Bridgewater, Ray Dalio's hedge fund, and they have we could do a whole session on how unique their work culture is. But a lot of just experiencing 4 months of working there helped me learn a couple of very valuable skills for organizational transformation. One is how to speak truth to power. How do you address the issue and not that as someone's personal idea or opinion, right? How do you challenge those things in a way that doesn't feel like I'm coming after James because you're the one who proposed this? That was a big skill. And then also just sort of understanding how to quantify capabilities that are seen as qualitative and reorganize those to affect good change. And so that was the sort of way I got there. Is eventually people recognized, to your point, I was being a pain in the ass. They didn't like getting these emails, but they read them. Yeah. And thankfully they read them, and they said, oh, this is really in the interest of the larger firm. We should sort of the same conversation only 20 years later. Let's channel that energy at ourselves. And so that's how it became this report out role into our executive board here, kind of saying, hey, here's what I think the honest truths of this are. And yeah, that's the journey.
And there you are. You've ended up where you are. So
yeah, I am.
What I want to try and do now is just go into some sort of short form answers, just to really get your opinion on a few matters. And we've touched on this already. So I suppose my first quick question really is, you've talked about culture a little bit, but what does culture actually mean to you?
Culture is a sense of fulfillment, a social fulfillment, a intellectual fulfillment. Those are really the key things, because so much of our time, the one thing we cannot get back, we dedicate to whatever company we work for. So I think it's a social and a intellectual fulfillment. And of course, we like to get paid too, but that's what I think it is. If all we're doing is getting paid, the novelty wears off.
Very true. And given some of the things that we've already found out about your background, I'm assuming this word probably means quite a lot to you. So I'm intrigued as to hearing your take on that digital transformation plan. What does it mean?
It means creating empowerment with digital tools. That's it. Like I said, I have a very clear and hard definition of digital transformation. Use technology to eliminate tedium and amplify the capabilities of your workforce. It's giving people superpowers, not replacing people.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's augmenting people in their current roles and there's so much talk around roles and tasks and where that's all going to go as well. So if you like what Jordan's just said there, it will be really interesting to go back into one of the edits on his journey to sort of where he is now as a director of PropTech at JLL. So do check out that video as well. And so lastly, in that sort of quick snippet of feelings, what does leadership mean to you in this role?
I think leadership is being decisive, but also empowering decision within your ranks. This is one of the things. I'm gonna just co-opt this question for a second, James.
Cool.
I think the word strategy has really had its meaning sort of lost over the past few years. And to me, strategy means giving people the know-how to make a decision without needing to ask, or knowing the confines of their decision-making abilities. I think one of the things that has plagued a lot of big organizations, JLL and many of the clients that I served, many of the big multinational clients that I served as a consultant, they saw strategy as deliver these marching orders. It's not a marching order. It's not a step-by-step instruction. It's a direction of travel. It's unifying the people that you've now empowered through digital transformation. It's unifying them towards a common goal. So let's go back a little bit to what your question was about the formation of Jll Technologies. That was an act of unifying people under this common goal of, we are going to transform ourselves from a legacy property services provider to a technology provider to this industry. Now, we are still a few steps into that journey, but having that direction of travel, it's a lot easier to get everybody on board with the direction of travel than to educate them to how those steps need to play out. And that's what I think leadership ultimately is.
Yeah, that's certainly that's more than I expected in that answer, and I think that's really interesting reference back to Jll Technologies. So if you are interested in that, there'll be another video here which is talking about sort of innovation more broadly at JLL and how Jll Technologies, JLL Spark all fit together with that, which will be well worth watching as well. So coming around, we had a brief discussion about what leadership means to you, and obviously within that role within JLL. So I'm just intrigued, given all of your experience with change management and obviously now PropTech, digital transformation, etc. What one tip would you give those sorts of leaders who are looking to get into this sort of area or who are already in it? What tip would you give them?
Reset the preferences on all your devices every 6 months to a year. And figure out honestly, I think reconfiguring, recalibrating what you use comes in so handy. I love so many things about working at JLL. What I've always disliked, having been at both small organizations and large organizations, organizations sort of get vendor locked into enterprise software. So we have to use their workflows, right? And, like, for instance, I'm working on a side project. We do everything out of Notion. I was like, oh my God, I wish I could use Notion for everything. And I think going back and resetting also just helps you sort of, there is a such thing as digital clutter. And that's what I would say is the only way to stay relevant. It's quite funny. I got asked a question not too long ago. So what did you want to be when you were young? And I actually wanted to be a radio DJ, right? And I told myself when I was young, so I couldn't be that anyway if I wanted to now, but I really didn't have the taste for music I thought I did. I just had a real passion for it. Yeah. And, one of the things I told myself when I was in my even late 20s, I was like, oh, I'm always going to stay up to speed on music. I'm going to make sure I'm paying attention and not just fall into what I like. My vinyl collection would say otherwise at this point. My Spotify list would say otherwise. My habits have sort of gotten into what they are. And so how have I gotten around that? Well, a bunch of my colleagues in the JLL Hong Kong office, we made a collaborative playlist. And every month,
well, let's see if Jordan returns here. Just
gone personal algorithm.
There we go. You're back. You cut for a second. it was just at the point when you're talking about collaborative playlists, and I have a feeling someone went, no, don't do that.
No. So we have
a playlist.
We have it's a similar vein. I think it's a similar exercise. It's sort of the mental reset. Every month, we reset this collaborative playlist, and each.
It looks like he's sadly just broken up again. That's a real shame. The internet was doing pretty well because in Hong Kong, sadly, where he is, it is not easy, as Jordan and I have attested to already over the last few moments.
This one really, it doesn't like this answer.
No, it just hates it, right? But do you know what? I'm gonna sort of finish this answer off by saying one thing, which is when you initially said reset everything after sort of 6 months, I was quite flippant and I sort of had a wry smile. And then when I sort of let it rest in my brain, I was like, absolutely right, because especially within the, in the real estate world, you choose a system and then you stick with it, and then you just almost get stubborn about it, and you as you said, you work to these enterprise processes which are not necessarily always right. And given the speed at which technology evolves, it doesn't just evolve the tech, but it also evolves the processes in which integrate with the tech, and then more importantly, perhaps, it's the changes in the mentality that come about because of those changes. Because otherwise you just get stuck in a rut and you never move forward. So I do think, all said and done, as soon as I was flippant, I removed it and I hit the point. So yeah, bang on. So let's try and move this on before we get stuck again. Just going to do a little bit of wordplay for a minute. I do this in all of my interviews, just really to get one word answers to a point, simply because I want to sort of create a little cool word cloud at the end of all of this to see what everyone thinks about different terms. So give me a term or a couple of words to describe the following words for me. PropTech.
Dated.
Okay. Innovation.
Misunderstood.
Leadership.
Difficult.
I honestly thought you were going to say strategy then, based on some of the other answers you've given me. Customer.
Soundboard.
Yeah, that's a nice one. It's really interesting to see the different perspectives for people when they say customer. Data.
The holy grail.
If only everybody felt the same way. I see it all the time in this sort of stuff. Values.
Defining.
Yeah, I figured you'd say something about that based on what you've talked about before when you talk about leadership and things like that. ESG.
Mission critical.
It's fascinating how over the last 6 months of the conferences I've been doing, whereas before ESG just was not ever mentioned, or really rather sustainability development goals, I should probably quantify further. And now every single conference is pinned to it, which is great. But and lastly, competitor.
No such thing if you're innovating.
Say that again.
There's no such thing if you're innovating.
No such thing. Oh, that is a good answer. I like that a lot. Cool. So last sort of a little sort of a personal question again. In terms of books, if you were to recommend a book to another leader in this sort of space, what book would you recommend and why?
Can I do a 3?
Yeah, totally. 100%.
Oh. So book number 1, Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard by Dan and Chip Heath. It's a wonderful anecdotal telling of how effective change has been accomplished. And I think it teaches one of the most valuable lessons that I've carried with me. So I read that book 12 years ago, something like that. And that made me want to become a change manager. And I did. And one of the lessons I took away from that, and I carry with me to this day, is to duplicate the bright spots. Find what works and make that work. I think too much of our industry and these conversations are dominated by these unhelpful cautionary tales. Don't become Nokia, don't become BlackBerry, these sorts of things. Like how could we even parse that to make it usable versus go look at what somebody's done right in your organization and see if that can be spread to the rest of the organization is a much smarter approach, I believe. And I've seen it be incredibly effective. The second book is a series of books, The Expanse, which is a sci-fi book series sort of set in our not so distant future, a couple hundred years from now, where we populate the solar system. Very grounded in reality, amazing storytelling. And I think too often we don't talk about fiction, but take the break. I love the audiobooks. I go out walking and I listen to them. And I have to say, I actually draw a ton of inspiration from these books directly back to what I'm doing. Because a lot of what we thought of as science fiction when I was young is our reality. We can have, we're doing this now. We're having a video conference from across the planet, right? So you can draw inspiration from good science fiction. And I think that sort of near future science fiction is great. And then the last one that I would say is The Principles by Ray Dalio. I had to read it long before it was sort of published as a book. When I went to work for Bridgewater, I read the PDF and all of the sort of the actual enumerated principles that they were at the time. But the culture that they've created at Bridgewater couldn't immediately be transplanted to just any organization. But again, can draw a lot of inspiration for how to effectively respond to changing societal, economic, and technological conditions. So all three of those.
So first and foremost, I'm determined to start a book club up again, because I'm amazed at how many readers actually do read and love to discuss the books that they've read with others and sort of pass on that knowledge. So that's one thing I will be doing over the next 6 months. The second thing, I just want to pick up on your point about the sci-fi side and how fiction is often almost belittled, to be honest, in the business community. And I entirely agree that there are some books which ultimately define the way that we look and view things. And I'm going to, put across a bit of a populist theory here, which, Ready Player One, which I read, years and years and years and years ago, was actually defining for me in my viewpoints and perspectives of where it could go and where it could take it. The Circle was another one by Dave Eggers. I remember reading that as well as a fictionalized account, and that was much more on the sort of the cultural and societal perspectives of control that social media platforms would have. And I remember actually at the time, and I think you may have seen it, I remember I'd read it and finished it, and I then read a couple of thoughts by Adam Newman at WeWork, and it was the inspiration of the I think relatively seminal article, which was The Cult of WeWork, and it was at the time when WeWork was flying high, and I was just like, this is all complete bullshit, and I just cannot believe that people are not seeing past it. And even then, I remember referring to references that WeWork employee were quoting about the life of WeWorkers, and then this Dave Eggers book and the culture that was built in the sort of imaginary company and this sort of cultish like company that was had. And I was just like, my God, it's like the same thing. So I'm with you that that fictionalized accounts can wholeheartedly inspire and determine the way that you look at the industry. So amen to that. Alrighty, so I'd like to just investigate a little bit. We've talked a lot about change management and innovation, leadership, etc. I'm fascinated by your frustrations with the innovation journey that either you've had or companies that you've seen have had. What really frustrates you about it all?
So I guess where I would start, especially in property, in the deployment of technology in the property industry, my biggest frustration is that we treat symptoms, not sort of a holistic therapeutic approach. And so our industry is often accused as being laggards. And I don't subscribe to that. I don't think that there's not like you mentioned, I have 90,000 colleagues. I wouldn't accuse any of them of being Luddites, but what we do is we will pick and choose sort of the buffet style of one or two technologies, and they they ultimately are going to overpromise and underdeliver because they're only so effective or they're only so visible. A lot of property technology is really thankless, right? The people who walk in that building, they don't care that you were able to manage a cooling downtime of 15 minutes. They just care that the indoor climate has been comfortable, right? Yeah. They don't care that whether it's a person keeping that bathroom sparkling or a robot. That's not part of the concern. So our industry is not necessarily laggards. We have very long tail expectations to meet, and that's where I think it's hard to see one thing getting adopted because it is treating a small part of it. So I think taking a step above, and where I say instead of treating symptoms, you may not be able to treat the sort of whole disease, if you will, because buildings are complex machines. But I think going after more than what I would call white collar solutions to white collar problems, that's really been what's frustrated me about innovation in the property technology and really sort of Silicon Valley led innovation at large for the last decade or so. So Mark Andreessen wrote the Software's Eating the World article, and ever since we've come out with, again, what I say are white collar solutions to white collar problems. Uber solved a great problem that I had as a white collar worker. But did it make the lives of Uber drivers around the world necessarily better? Not really, right? Like, that's not a dig at Uber. This is a reconciliation of whether or not we're really solving problems or if we're, just sort of rebalancing convenience. And so that, I think for me, that's it. We're not doing enough to serve the people who have the most tedium, to go back to that point that I've made earlier. The most tedious jobs, the most thankless jobs, you give them better tools. And when I say data is the holy grail, those better tools through their regular acts of cleaning, of compliance, of maintenance, of repairs, when those become sources of data, that all floats up to the rest of a business like ours, right? If we have every inspection record for every building that we have under management digitalized, that makes us the best valuers in the world, because we don't just know how an asset performs, we know how every brand of light bulb performs, right? And so that's where I think it's still innovation, and really all sort of technology is still too top down, right? I think William Gibson really put it best. He said, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And if we really distributed to the people who are doing the least desirable, the most tedious work, I think the rising tide would do much better than this top-down approach that has been innovation writ large, but more so in the laggarding property industry.
Just may I sort of push back a little bit on that in terms of a question?
Yeah.
And I'm going to reference almost your first sentence in your answer, which was along the lines of, we tend to treat the symptoms and we don't take a holistic perspective to the industry. Is it because we can't take a holistic approach because the property industry is too broad, in the sense of, we have retail, office, commercial, home, and then within that we have all the nuances of each different asset class and the way that it's worked. Then we have all the geographical nuances of, the way that Hong Kong deals with its asset classes compared to Nigeria deals with theirs. We have multiple challenges with multiple nuances, which have tremendous problems to be able to create such a one-size-fits-all, holistic, wonderful panacea of problem solving.
Well, I would never say that there's one size fits all. In fact, I hate that. I hate that cliche. I mentioned this on a presentation not long ago. There is another bad thing that people in our industry like to say, and especially in prop tech, is there's no one size fits all solution, and that's kind of like that literally is like 7 words to say nothing. What I am advocating for, and we'll kind of go back to the data point, right, is data allows us to, not necessarily us, in fact, AI is doing most of this work now, is to recognize patterns that humans cannot. And so that's where, it's an insurmountable task to try to create data categories that are uniform. But if we just gather the data and find the commonalities, then we start to find those things, whether it's Hong Kong or Nigeria or anywhere else. And that will help us. So again, we need to establish the standards from what the data is that we gather and what as much of that as we can automate. And that will help us find commonality. There are definitely commonalities across all asset classes. I think this is why a lot of the origins of many of the more operations focused property technology is around energy consumption, because that's pretty consistent and measurable across all of them. You go to the transaction layer and there's so many online property marketplaces, and that's because that's a pain everyone has felt in every place in the world.
Yeah.
And that in itself is part of why we end up with a lot of white collar solutions, white collar problems. People are leaving established firms and doing startups because they're tired of the process of, say, using that enterprise software that they don't like. And instead, when they went and reset their configurations, they're like, you know what, I can just build this better myself. So I think that's the sort of push and pull of innovation, especially relative to PropTech. But I mentioned earlier that one of the best lessons I took away from that book, Switch, is to duplicate the bright spots. That's not limited to your organization. So one of the things I try to do is point out to our leadership in JLL, when you want to duplicate the bright spots, if we want to be a digital services provider to our industry, we should look at what has Google done right? What has Amazon done right? Now I can point to two really big ones. Is Google put data first and foremost. Data was the tip of their spear. They organized the world's information simply by letting people input data and see what happens. Amazon, in their case with Amazon Web Services, got tired of trying to reconfigure tools every time they went to launch something new. They built their own internal set of tools, which became Amazon Web Services. So those success stories are the kinds that we can model and we can replicate, not just within our business at JLL, but in any industry. And your question earlier about data, if you subscribe to the idea that data is the new oil, then our sector is the largest untapped oil well in the entire world. And we joke around that our industry is a bunch of dinosaurs, but the reality is our industry is a bunch of millions of years old dead dinosaurs. We tap the oil in those everyday processes. We tap that data, and our machines are going to run like crazy. And our technological innovation is going to be absolutely turbocharged.
And when the property industry's business is all about cash flow and the challenge for it, I mean, data surely opens up a treasure trove of opportunities. But that's for them to work it out in their own time. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to work out where I want to take this now, because I think there's a really interesting angle. You've referenced about the leadership at JLL. You also referenced very early on that you came into sort of JLL Asia Pacific through a workplace move, and then through you being outspoken and you doing series of email newsletters. They realized there was a need for the sorts of insights that you were bringing into the more sort of wider and broader JLL community. So, but I'm also very aware that you're a team of one. You're not like a normal sort of innovation leadership team that perhaps I've had on this discussions previously. So I'm really interested in terms of understanding how have you or your leadership team developed this innovation PropTech strategy, and how is it deployed, and who leads on it, and that sort of information within Asia Pac?
Yeah, I think while I haven't necessarily, again, the nature of my job changed quite a bit as Jll Technologies sort of rolled out and developed, matured. But I want to point to a program that we did that actually didn't originate from me. I was just a very active participant in it, that I found was incredibly effective. Our Asia Learning and Development team developed what they called a techathon, not a hackathon, right? Hackathons tend to be these very firework, corporate sloganism type of exercises. Hey, everyone come in, don't have to sit at your desk. You guys are going to team build. There's going to be sandwiches, and you're going to come up with a great idea and present it. And then that'll be the last we hear, right? There might be an email that goes out. This is not what I'm talking about. What the techathon was, and my cynical ass actually sat through one of the first techathon sessions and was like, just basically rolling my eyes, like, why are we doing this? Like, basically what it was your team could pick 2 of 4 exercises, build a web scraper, do some geocaching. I don't remember exactly what the other ones were, but I just was like, I participated, but hardly. And then a friend of mine within the company, I was kind of just whinging about it, and he was like, that's not for you. That's for people who are less comfortable with technologies. And it sent it. I needed that moment of clarity, but it really ended up being this powerful thing where we made people comfortable with the notion. When we say we are turning into a technology firm for the industry, that doesn't mean we want you to be software engineers. We don't need you to forge the tools. We need you to be comfortable using them and talking about them. And so that really helped. When I talk about that strategic mission and what leadership ultimately is, again, you can't educate a workforce as big as ours. You just cannot do it. But you can inspire them by letting them get their hands dirty in this way. So not only did we put together this session, we actually then had a video submission contest for people to submit because we have 90,000 people in JLL. What most people don't know is 42,000 of them are in Asia. I mean, our workforce is huge in Asia. Yeah. So I think that's part of why people power is so important to me, right? We have this huge workforce. There is power in those numbers if we turn them into data harvesters, right? But what we did was we had a video submission contest where people could basically give an audition video, and we flew, I think, 30 of my colleagues from all around the Asia Pacific region, so 15 geographies, flew them all into Singapore. And those of us involved with the leadership portion of PropTech, whether it's our executive board or some of the other leaders and myself, who was fairly new in the role at the time, we put them through like a 3-day course, including things like we had a pub quiz night and things like that. But we trained the trainers essentially and then sent them back out. A year later, we had 3,000 of our colleagues had gone through these techathon sessions. And that leads to kinds of conversations like the one my friend had with me. Hey, when someone else is complaining, I don't want to be a tech company, this is stupid. Like, no, actually, this is really cool. We did this thing, right? We built a chatbot in 20 minutes, right? That, I mean, to me, like, I'll always point to that as something that was just a phenomenal way to inspire and lead our workforce. And those techathons still go on today. They're actually starting to pick back up now that in most places we're not under such restrictions.
We'll do that. Most in inverted commas. And so you're using those techathons and the sort of the all hands type concept of helping you drive. This is what I'm intrigued by, because you said something I didn't expect. To drive tech adoption, or is it to continue that familiarity with that transformation journey that JLL are going to support customers on and making your employees more comfortable? Which is the priority on those sorts of initiatives?
It's making employees more comfortable, right? Like it absolutely, like, in an organization as big as ours, like, I don't care if you're the CEO or anybody else. You rule with an iron fist, and people just go out the door to the next place, right? It is coalition building, not consensus building, but coalition building is the key to good transformation, right? people like to use the container ship metaphor that like, oh, a small course correction sets us on an entirely different path. I like a Viking ship, right? Everyone's rowing, right? And the more people we can get to row even slightly in the direction that we want to go, that's how you do it. Like, great transformation is coalition building, and it is empowering people. Like, the whole conversation of future of work that dominates our industry, really just dominates the entire work conversation, is really just this white collar angst, right? And so we need to put that angst at ease. And the way that you do that is, like, I think there's some really great explorations going on around AI now. AI is not going to replace our jobs anytime soon.
Agreed.
It's going to change how we do them. Our mutual friend Daryl is doing amazing prompts with AI and DALL-E and creating these amazing pieces of art. And he'll tell you, I'm not an artist. He's making amazing art with DALL-E. And I think that goes back to reset your own internal configuration, adopt these new tools, but these are tools of superpowers. I like to say that, these new AI tools are more like Microsoft Clippy than they are like Skynet, right? Yep. They're a better version of Clippy. How can I make this faster be done for you? And yeah, it's an exciting time, but you got to get people comfortable with it.
You have, and I'm just going to reference your point about AI art there. I mean, I've seen some of the people produce art, which is amazing, with prompts which are so broad, it's incredible. My art still manages to be shocking. I still can't get even an AI to make my ideas seem even remotely plausible. But
I'll send you. There's actually a really great. Someone has created a template for prompts so that like it's a bunch of drop downs. So you could be like this, and this, and even then. So this is what I talk about. We evolve as collaborators, right? So how old are these tools? They're not that old. And then someone else has made something that helps people make a prompt. One of the things I've been banging the drum a lot about on social media is I hate the term metaverse, right? And I hate it. I know why I hate it. I hate it because I'm a lifelong gamer, and it feels like the whole idea of gaming worlds has been co-opted. To serve like what people think is the next big thing, and they're not actually building a better thing. But the reason I think it's a bad term, and Tim Cook said something to this effect very recently, is it's not making it accessible. Smartphones existed before the iPhone, but Apple made it easy enough that my mom can use it. My mom doesn't use it well. When she FaceTimes me, I get an up-close picture of her ear every time because she still uses it like a phone. But Apple has made devices so easy that it's accessible. And then on the other, so much of this metaverse conversation is dominated by mysticism, right? Or obfuscation. So back to your point about WeWork, it was a lot of, this is just a different version of digital smoke and mirrors. And, that's not how effective transformation happens at a macro level, at an organizational level, or even at a team level. It's coalition building. And
to summarize, you said it's coalition building, not what building?
Consensus building. And the reason I say it's not consensus building is consensus building tends to force regression to the mean. You don't want to say, okay, how many people can we get to agree, right? My house we're a family of two in my house, and just getting myself and my girlfriend to agree what to have for dinner ends up being a full exercise. So when you extrapolate that to bigger numbers, when you start to try to just consensus build, even at a board level, right? So even executive boards, when you're consensus building, it's a tendency towards the safest, most known route, and that's antithetical to good, effective innovation. You want a coalition build, get people to come along on the journey. Again, read the book Switch. They really frame this up nicely. And I actually read that book probably once a year at least, just to sort of refresh myself. Hey, these are some core tenets to affect, real change at scale.
Super. And I think it's really interesting. And I'm trying desperately not to go down a metaverse rabbit warren of discussion with you, because I know we're pretty much on a similar side with that against some others which are perhaps not quite there yet.
Well, can I say one thing on it?
Yeah,
I think a lot of it is more semantic than anything. Great digital experiences are emerging, and they won't be as interconnected and intercompatible as, again, it's being insinuated. But like our industry, like there's a lot to be said about the way that augmented reality, especially, will enhance the way people interact with assets. So I love that there's this hungering for a more interactive future. I just think the standard bearers at the moment are leading us. They're leading us to where they want to go instead of to where we'll take them. And it's not a malicious thing or anything. It's the same thing. We call this an iPhone because that's what Apple called it. But phone is like not the most commonly used app for anybody. But if Apple went to the market and said, hey, we got a handheld telegraph machine for you, everyone would be like, what the hell, right? But that's what we use it for. We WhatsApp, we text, like we are largely text interaction these days. We tweet even. That's the first port of call for the way that we interact now.
But I think I think it's even more basic than that, Jordan, if I may, which is, there's a lot of people talking a lot of technical jargon and discussion around things like the metaverse and AI. And what pisses me off about it all, and is I think is fundamental to the misinformation and the mistrust, and ultimately where companies will take a wrong stance on all of this is that of the very, very basic macro perspective of Amara's law. In that we're overestimating what's going to happen in the short term, and we're underestimating what's going to happen in the long term. And I just think people wholeheartedly miss that perspective, and they're so convinced and very quick to do things down when something doesn't quite work the way it should in the short term, or it's not quite perfect, or the way that society views it is negative at the moment because of political will or because of some PR aspect which they've got wrong, and we're missing the point about where it's going. And I think we are incredibly guilty of doing that within the real estate industry, which is we make quick and rash decisions based on public perception and political perception of some of these things. And we actually, some of the leaders, they miss that step then, and they're not bringing people like yourself in this instance to come in and to continue looking at these opportunities and actually almost forget all of the publicity that surrounds them to look at the application and understand actually what the possible implications will be, not in 2 years' time, but in 10 or 20 years' time. And that is where I think leadership needs to strengthen, which is to be resistant to short-term frighteners on the whole thing. Oh my God, I need to get off this discussion. I'll go down a rabbit warren. And ultimately, this is really about you guys. So I'm very conscious that we're really dragging over time, because you and I will always have a lot to say. So let's just go for. Have you got 5 more minutes or so?
Yeah, of course.
Cool. Look, let's just cover 2 more things. One is around transformation journey that you've been on and lessons, and the other one is sort of. I'd like to look at JLL and ESG in the sort of Asia Pac region, because I should imagine you can't really comment on broader JLL strategy, but perhaps Asia you can. So let's just finish off with those 2 things. So touching really on the lesson that you've had with the digital transformation journey, and this is specific, I suppose, to your real estate experience rather than the much broader experience that I know you've had and we've covered in other edits for this. What's the biggest lesson that you've learned working through JLL on an element of their digital transformation journey over in Asia Pacific?
I'm going to shout out to a very smart person who worked at JLL for a while, but not at the same time as me, Sue Lin. Sue once said to me as I was trying to make sense of something, she said, "You are not your user." And that lesson has stayed with me throughout, is we really have to recognize. So when I say white collar solutions to white collar problems, oftentimes that's what I'm offering. And I need to take a step back and say, oh, well, like, is this actually, like, am I, the customer is your soundboard. And, we use terms in innovation culture like internal customer. Well, if you're not listening to them, if you're not letting them be the same kind of soundboard your external customers are, you're doing your job wrong. So the biggest lesson, you are not your user. Thank you, Sue.
Yeah. And you know what? That's succinct. It's true. And we should all be living by it. So, yeah. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Sue.
Right. That was really, really easy. So I'll tell you what then, I'm going to, as we've just rattled off a quick question, I'm going to give you another quick question. This was a suggestion in series 1 that was to be added in about imposter syndrome. And I think it's really viable. But given your role within JLL, do you suffer from imposter syndrome, and how do you deal with it if you do?
I do, absolutely. I'm trying. I've been, as Jll Technologies matures and my role, sort of is less defined as it was when I first started. I think it's actually been a bit amplified, and part of it is trying to take on new challenges. Part of it is to try to offer my services. But I think the bigger part of it is to learn, to try to understand. So kind of calling back to you're not your user. I was very skeptical of venture capital for a long time. So, to me, it always seemed like the sort of fundamental question of venture capital is, do venture capitalists create innovation or do they merely show up for it, right? And my view was always they show up for it. Like, I didn't see them as contributors. But as I got more and more involved with venture capital deals within JLL, outside of JLL, helping my friends with their venture funds, and listened to a book called The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby. So there's number 4 for you. And hearing the stories of the way that great venture capital deals unfolded, and hearing even how some of the bad ones became what they were, really opened my eyes to that world. And so, like, say I worked in venture capital, I probably feel a certain degree of imposter syndrome, but I think the easiest way to abate that is to get people's stories. So you mentioned earlier that I'm good to talk to about a craft beer. My favorite thing to do is sit down and, just as you asked my story, how did I get to where I am? Hearing people's war stories, there's so many lessons to be drawn from that. And one of the things I would say, a little piece of advice on how to deal with that is, if your guiding principle for great transformation is amplify the bright spots. When somebody's telling you a horror story, say, what in that really worked? What was good? When my previous job at JLL was workplace strategy and moving people to open office workplaces, people love that transformation, right? So there was a lot of finding the bright spots and took a lot of extraction to do so. But building on those towards the end of delivering those change projects, had some really great tools in our arsenal to do exactly that. So ask people, the 2 pieces of advice how to deal with imposter syndrome. Ask people stories, not instructions, but stories. Hear their stories. When you're getting that story, ask for them what the bright spots were.
And it's quite interesting in terms of that role shift that I'm sure you've been on and will continue to be on with JLL Spark sort of coming in and Jll Technologies having much more of a influential role in your space, because I suppose it means that your role is transitioning and shifting, and you too, as part of that sort of imposter syndrome challenge, is to find the bright spots in your role, in your career, and understanding what actually you know more than anybody else, and understanding. So that makes perfect sense. So let's cut to our sort of final quick discussion, and I should probably paraphrase that question, or I should really edit that question a little bit better to be JLL Asia Pacific. Earlier on, when we did the wordplay, you talked about ESG being mission critical in all of this. So do you have much of an insight and a role within that strategy of developing the sort of the ESG guidance within JLL?
I'm fortunate enough to be asked to be part of a lot of the conversations with our ESG strategy. Part of that is because my line manager is a gentleman named Alberto Vidi, who heads up our property and asset management business, and he's the COO of Asia Pacific. He has been a proponent of ESG strategy for a very long time. Like, I honestly, not saying that to publicly kiss butt, he has been a proponent long before it was en vogue. And we've had a solid team, just contributors. I've sadly had to say goodbye to a couple recently because they're so in demand, right? Like, I mean, it's become a very hot item, but we've taken it very seriously as long as I've been at JLL. But what I would say here, the things that impact us the most here in Asia, I think Asia has such a diverse set of challenges because, places like Hong Kong and Singapore, super modern, built into the clouds, but also built on a lot of reclaimed land. So our challenges aren't as immediate, but we could very well have a lot of the assets that we manage underwater if sea levels rise dramatically. So there's challenges like that here, but then we have challenges with actual toxic waste and things in some parts of Southeast Asia. We have trouble with traffic in a lot of Southeast Asia. I would say one of the big things that we're doing, because there's still commercial drivers at play here, is collaborating with some of the biggest conglomerates in Asia to develop smart cities, and usually that's from a transit-oriented development standpoint, so we can hopefully reduce traffic. Like, yes, real estate assets are sort of the biggest contributor to embodied carbon in the world, but that's also because shelter is a fundamental human need. So, like, to simply attribute all of that to real estate, I think is unfair. There's lots of work to be done, but bring it back full circle, you get good data on all of these things, and you can deal with the problem.
But speaking to JLL particularly, and I'm really interested in that line that you talked about. You have a really unique set of challenges just because of the way that Asia is set up. How does JLL in your region deal with that?
Well, I mean, we have a dedicated team of I think it's around 20 people at this point.
Okay.
A lot of that is consultancy work, working with especially investors and developers to form their ESG strategy. But I think the biggest thing is actually for us is giving them measurable and achievable goals, because even the things like COP26 or like Singapore has 2030 targets, Hong Kong has 2050 targets, those are still abstractions. So a lot of what our work is right now is just putting a roadmap in front of that. Here are the things you can do now, right? And making it piecemeal enough that this is one of the things about that I think leads to this stereotype of conservatism in the property industry is that, an asset is depreciated from day one. Like, you factor that in, that depreciation, this isn't some crazy actuarial calculation. You kind of, what the decline looks like. So being able to help them cut that off at the pass, especially with an already built building, that's a big one. But the more actionable ones, which is what I think you're asking, is what I said before, is helping develop smart precincts from the ground up. So one of the companies we've been talking to and working with is a hydrogen fuel company. So applying that to logistics developments, helping logistics developers look at hydrogen fuel trucks that can't necessarily do full sort of trucking and logistical delivery, but they can be the vehicles that take care of that whole development. They can be the vehicles that go back and forth from a yard and things like that, which means now you can actually take the waste, have it converted into hydrogen fuel, and then put that into these trucks. So you're making a more circular economy at a portfolio level. And these are interesting explorations that are going on, especially in places like Vietnam, where you had a huge influx of industrial development over the last few years.
It's so wide-reaching, and it impacts everybody so differently depending on their geographical perspectives and their buildings and all this sort of stuff. So it's always going to be a challenge, and it's interesting where you pick up on the hydrogen side there, because again, that's always looking forward rather than the sort of the retrofitting, which I think is going to be the the biggest challenge that our industry is going to face as we go on. But yeah, it's a really interesting insight. At least
there are some retrofitting activities, James, but I think that I would be looking for a job if I started talking about some of the things that we're developing. We have some really interesting.
But you're developing in-house here, or you're investing in?
So we're co-developing some strategies to help with that retrofitting, but it is a couple of them are very proprietary, and I'm very excited about when they come out because I'm an active player in those discussions. And that's not limited to us, right? Like I like to think we don't have competition based on the what I posited earlier, but people who would call, or organizations that people would call our competitors, are doing some great things in the ESG space too. I personally, I think it's as urgent as I said it is. It's mission critical, but I do feel like it's a challenge that humanity in our industry is really ready to meet. I think that we're going to see a lot of change in the next few years, and it's easy to be cynical about it, especially when we see all the sort of hazardous weather that's gone on the last few years. But I do feel like it is something that people are tackling in earnest across the industry.
Yeah, I entirely agree. Okay, so I am very, very conscious that we've gone on longer than any other conversation I've had so far to date. And
I've got to get for that.
But partly, to be fair, it's because you talk so well and you're able to sort of summarize things brilliantly, and it comes full circle with some of your thoughts and passions about it all. So I'm going to finish the stream there to allow everybody